All right, some big developments actually in terms of Ukraine. Let's go ahead and put this first piece up on the screen. This is from the Washington Post. They say they have a scoop that the Biden administration is actually privately encouraging Ukraine's leaders to signal an openness to negotiate with Russia and drop their public refusal to engage in peace talks unless Putin is removed from power. I mean, you guys might recall the trajectory of this. Early in the war, Zelensky was much more open, sort of floating negotiations, even floating some of what they might be willing to compromise on. And then, frankly, understandably, given the level of atrocities and the level of conflict and death and attacks on infrastructure and all of those sorts of things, he's really closed the door and said, absolutely not. Not as long as Putin is in power. And also, by the way, we want to not just, retake the parts of Ukraine that were really firmly in our control before this invasion, but we want Crimea back. We want the entire East back. And so his position is really hardened. There were no indications that the Biden administration was pushing them to sort of soften that even rhetoric whatsoever, even as, ultimately this is an incredibly dangerous situation, as we've laid out a million times here at this point. If it's going to end, there's going to have to be some sort of ceasefire negotiation. There's going to have to be some sort of diplomacy. It also comes on the heels, of course, of the fated letter, the ill-fated, I guess, letter from the Progressive Caucus, where they, in the mildest possible language, floated that maybe, possibly at some point, with the consent of the Ukrainians, considering diplomacy would be a good idea. Total freak out online about how this was horrible and you're stabbing Ukraine in the back and you're a Putin apologist and you're aligned with the Kremlin and all of this. They immediately retract it. Well, now it turns out that their letter is actually literally just what the Biden administration policy already appears to be.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Also with the breaking news, actually, Krystal, that these White House officials were having some undisclosed talks with Putin. That almost, frankly, might be the most significant. Let's put this up there on the screen. Jake Sullivan actually has been having these confidential discussions with Russian counterparts. Now, according to them, it has not been over Ukraine. It's been over nuclear threats, about escalation. But this is an incredibly welcome development because what is something that we kept underscoring during the whole nuclear, we're like, we need to talk. The whole lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was have the hotline so that we never have this level of confusion ever again. And all the leaks that were coming out in some of the hottest rhetoric during the nuclear threats from the Russians was that there's no bilateral dialogue. So it seems that I think clearly the dam broke in the Biden administration. They're looking down at a possible GOP victory in the House, where Kevin McCarthy has already said we're not going to pass nearly the amount of Ukraine aid. It's not a guarantee that they pass the $60 billion extra in Ukraine aid that they want to in the lame duck. So they're like, well, our hands are going to be very different in the next couple of months. At the same time, the Ukrainians are reaching the limits, possibly, of their battlefield victory. I said possibly. They've had stunning victories. We don't know. We have nuclear threats. The American public is afraid. Inflation is sky high across here in Europe. And, it's not like the situation in Kyiv is all that great. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. So now is the time. And what we were saying is that by giving the Ukrainians basically a blank check and saying you can prosecute this till the end of time, even if whenever it comes to hurt our own core strategic interests, that's always been my objection.
Yeah.
And so to see them engaging in talks, possibly behind the scenes, nudging them in the right way, I think that's great. Will Zelensky listen? Honestly, I don't think so. Well, I don't think he will listen. The Ukrainian population, or at least the ones in the West, they're not there right now. And Zelensky, I'm going to say is kind because I think he's done good for his own people. But his bravado and the way he talks with the West, and really the level of which he admonishes anyone who doesn't want to give him anything that he wants here in the West and all that, what is the evidence that he actually will listen to any of these private admonishments from the Biden administration?
The question is how hardball are the Biden people willing to play? Are you willing to say, next time you come calling for your next, multi-10 billions of dollars handout to not just for the weapons aid, but for economic aid to fund your government to be able to continue Ukraine as a going concern, which they're really reliant on our aid in order to do any of that. The answer might be different if you don't change the way that you're even publicly speaking about the possibility of negotiations. I personally have no doubt that if the Biden administration was willing to play that kind of hardball, you would hear a softening of tone because his fate and the fate of the country is so tied to what we here are ultimately willing to do. But, I don't know if the Biden administration is really willing to go that hard.
Right.
There are a few things that I think about here that could have kind of led the Biden administration to a bit of a different, certainly a different approach than what we were hearing in the early days of we don't want negotiations and dispatching Boris Johnson probably to go and tell Zelensky, no, we don't want diplomacy. We don't want an end to this war. We want to weaken Russia. Basically out and out saying that our goal in this whole thing is to overthrow Putin and have regime change in Russia. This is a very different stance and tone than what we saw in those early days from Biden himself and also from Lloyd Austin and other high-level officials. You think about the call that was reported with Biden and Zelensky, where Biden's very frustrated and reportedly basically lost his temper and yelled at Zelensky over the fact that we're giving you all this aid and then you immediately turn around and ask for even more, even more, even more. It's never enough and you're basically ungrateful. So look, that may sound petty, but the sort of personality conflicts, especially for a player like Biden, who is not unlike Trump in that he's kind of a gut player on a foreign policy front, that makes a difference. And then I also have to think, the revelations that the Ukrainians were involved in that firebombing in Moscow, you're freelancing, murder, assassinating private citizens in Russia. What the hell are you doing? Even the Crimean Bridge explosion, which, the best indications are this was a truck bomb that, the Ukrainians were able to blow up the Crimean Bridge. This is a legitimate military target. I'm not saying that it's not, but Crimea is a different deal than the rest of Ukraine, and that also was very provocative, very escalatory, and that's when we saw the height of the worst rhetoric and the worst possibilities of potential tactical nuclear weapon use. So I feel like, and the other piece that I would add to this too is, there are a lot of indications that we actually have had very little insight into what the Ukrainians are planning, how they're prosecuting the war, that we had more intel about what the Russians were planning to do than what our own allies, the Ukrainians, were willing to do. I have to think all of this has led to the Biden administration saying, you know what, we need to make a bit of a pivot here.
You're absolutely correct. And also, poll came out, ABC News, Washington Post poll, 50-something% of GOP voters now say we're giving too much aid to Ukraine. That number was 6 back in March. So consider that a complete flip in the way that GOP voters are considering it, and those people are now going to be in power. So I think that more than anything also could impact the way that they're not stupid. They have to look at unified government is going away, which means that you're going to have to make very, very different choices whenever you're reliant on a very compliant Congress.
Well, and it also, in a sense, I know Biden wants Democrats to hold on to control of the House and the Senate, but it actually gives him a bit of a point of leverage with
absolutely.
Zelensky.
Right.
Whether the Republicans are ultimately full of shit, which they probably are or not,
I think they are.
You can, the incoming likely Speaker of the House says he's done. And look at this poll. My population is shifting, so you're going to have to work with me here. Otherwise, you can't count on this, just continued, consistent shipment of weapons and aid. So that has probably strengthened his hand in some of these negotiations. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.